Hi everyone, it's Janice from the Divorcing Religion podcast. Did you know that it costs me money to produce each episode of this podcast? I'd really appreciate your help to keep my show on the air and helping other people. Please join me over on Patreon, where you can also find commercial-free episodes, and the links are in the show notes. Thanks so much. Hi everyone, welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious recovery consultant. Today's show is all about humanism. In case you don't know, I'm proud to serve as the vice president of CASHA, Kelowna Atheists, Skeptics, and Humanists Association. Since my guest and I are both Canadian, before we get started, here is the definition of humanism from Humanist Canada. Humanism is a progressive philosophy of life based on a profound respect for human dignity and the conviction that human beings are ultimately accountable to themselves and to society for their actions. It is a secular worldview that affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical and meaningful lives. I'm delighted to welcome Ian Bushfield as my guest today. Ian has been involved in the BC Humanist Association since 2009, and aside from a brief stint in the United Kingdom, he has been the Executive Director of BCHA since 2012. Ian has a background in physics and nonprofit management and grew up in Alberta. In 2017, he also joined the BC Civil Liberties Association's Board of Directors. Welcome, Ian. It's nice to see you again.
It's so good to talk to you, Janice.
We got to meet in person this summer when you came out to address CASHA, the group that I'm a part of. And it was really interesting to hear the things that you had to say. Of course, you are closer to a large city center, so I'm in the interior of British Columbia, the Okanagan Valley, and you are near Vancouver. So there's a lot more going on out there than there is here.
Yeah, I'm based in Coquitlam on the unceded territories of the Coquitlam people, which is still in Metro Vancouver, but it's at the end of the SkyTrain that has only recently come out this far. So it's very suburban. And don't put CASHA down so much. You are doing so much out there. I think you have more in-person events than we have in Metro Van right now. And it's a fantastic little community you have out there.
Yes, I'm really thrilled to be part of it. And it's so funny because when I was a deeply devout Christian, to me, one of the worst things you could say about somebody was to call them a secular humanist. Like, what a terrible insult to call somebody that. And now here I am, the vice president of the local group. So I think that's really interesting. And I'm wondering, were you raised in a humanist family?
That's a good question, and I don't actually know how to answer it. So my family wasn't religious growing up. I can say that for sure. We didn't go to church. We celebrated Christmas, but it was a largely secular affair. Easter was very secular. It was about the Easter bunny, chocolate, and maybe skiing when we were really lucky, and we did a lot of ski trips. So there was no overt attempt to bring religion into my household, and I don't even really know what my parents' spiritual beliefs are, even to this day. Wow. But I think I grew up in southern Alberta, just outside Calgary in rural Alberta. And Alberta has this duality. I think a lot of people in Canada think of it as Texas of the North. But when you look at census results, it is the second least religious province in English Canada, at least. BC was about 50% no religion in 2021. I think Alberta is already getting up into the high 30s or low 40s. But what's unique about Alberta is there's a very deep evangelical movement as well, and Mormon movement. So there's it's this polarized province between the secularism and the religion. And there's not a lot of the mushy middle Protestantism you see in the Northeast US or in Eastern Canada, or even the mushy Catholicism of Quebec, although a lot of that has evaporated, especially as well. And so my family, I think, had humanist values, but we didn't identify as humanists, so we didn't really talk about it in that frame. It was only when I got to university that I really started to explore those kind of beliefs and thoughts.
Yes, and that was university in Alberta?
Yeah, in Edmonton there. So I went to University of Alberta for engineering. I didn't know really what I wanted to be, but I knew I liked science and that kind of thing. So I went into that field. And when I got there, what I found was we had a thriving campus community with so many different clubs. And a couple years in, I was really involved in student life. And I was noticing, I was reading the Dawkins books and those that were all coming out at the time, the early mid 2000s. And the campus groups, hundreds of campus groups, there was just so many religious ones, right? There were so many different kinds of Christian ones. There was Muslim one, Jewish one, Sikh one, and so forth. But I was like, well, I'd been involved in the Edmonton atheist meetup group that had gotten started at that time. And I was like, where's the group on campus for the atheists? And so me and some friends started the Atheist and Agnostic Student Club. And I think this was 2005 or 2006. Maybe even a year or two later, but we got that going, and we got a little bit of funding from the Students Association that goes to every campus club. We got a table at Clubs Fair one year. For our first year, we put up this like homemade banner, and we had like 300 students be like, we want to know more about this club, send us email. We were like, all right, there's something here.
Amazing.
Yeah, it was very rewarding. We were just very busy for 2 days, just like talking to people and getting names down on our sheet.
Wow. So there definitely is an interest. And you're right when you say Canadians often tend to think of Alberta as the Canadian Texas. And of course, with my first husband, we went to Prairie Bible College, which is in Three Hills, southern Alberta there. So my experience of Alberta is very religious indeed. However, tomorrow night I'm addressing the Rocky Mountain Atheists group. I'm trying to undo all the stuff that I did, I think, when I was so deeply religious. And so I'm wondering then, I wrote down some just different ideas about humanism. And one thing I found on the Humanist International site says humanists base their understanding of the world on reason and science, rejecting supernatural or divine beliefs. And I wonder what that means then. Does it preclude religious adherents from being humanists?
It's a good question, right? Because the word humanism has been used many times in many different fields throughout history. I think it first came up in the Renaissance era as there was a movement in art and in philosophy to really start actually centering humanity rather than the divine or other spiritual realms in that. But those were still very religious people. You couldn't be an atheist in medieval Europe pretty easily. You could maybe question whether the Bible was literal or metaphorical, but even that bordered on heresy at times, right? Yeah. It depends on the community. I think the Netherlands was a little bit safer than, say, Italy. But so you start seeing the ideas of Renaissance humanism, and that is a religious kind of humanism. But over the years, it evolves. And what we talk about when we're the BC Humanist Association or Humanist International is a phrasing of it that started kind of at the start of the 20th century. And it drew roots from earlier movements, but the word humanism as we use it today is a secular philosophy. It is a non-religious philosophy. Now, can you be a Christian humanist? Yes. That is someone who is still a Christian and maybe believes in Jesus, but tries to focus those teachings more on humans and the life we have here and now. But in terms of secular humanism, it is, I say at very least, it makes belief in God irrelevant. But as we've defined it, as Humanist International has defined it, there is no room for the supernatural in it because we use our faculties to understand the world.
Yes. And certainly, I know I've run across a number of folks who've grown up in Jewish homes who would absolutely count themselves as humanists. And it feels like one of the problems we run into in Christianity is that exactly what you said, whether people are going to take it literally or not. And when we do, if someone does take it literally, there's not much wiggle room for anything else. So, okay, I just wondered about that.
And that's one of the approaches that's different in humanism, I find, is one of the core values is an anti-dogmatism. So even the definition of humanism has evolved over the years, over the century and a half since the word was really coined. And we see that through the evolution of humanist manifestos and the fact we have so many philosophers involved that they just feel like writing so much. So defining what exactly humanism is very individualistic in many ways. We can agree on some common values, but what does that look like in practice can vary a lot. So even, us as the BC Humanist Association, we have a way we practice it, but that is not necessarily the only way to be a humanist, and we don't try to pretend it is.
Okay. Yeah. And that does make sense. And to be fair, that is also how it goes with religions as well. So the way Islam is practiced in one place is not the way that it's practiced. And same with the Christianity, can vary from family to family, from person to person. So it makes sense that humanism also has different interpretations through time and space and the people who are practicing it. I wondered about the difference between morality and ethics. So Humanists International states that humanists are non-religious people who strive to lead fulfilling, meaningful, and ethical lives, using reason and empathy to guide their decisions and actions. And then I was wondering, well, what is the difference between morality and ethics? And I went to geeksforgeeks.org. And they said, the main difference between ethics and morality is that ethics typically provide a formal, context-specific, and standardized framework for assessing right and wrong, while morality is more personal, subjective, and rooted in individual beliefs and values. So morals are what you believe, ethics are what you do. Morals are often based on religion and culture. Ethics are based on logic and reason. Is this how you see it?
Honestly, I try to avoid falling down the semantic debates around some of these terms because, I find they can be really interesting in philosophical circles, but in terms of the practical day-to-day, I don't actually think about the difference that much. I think what we tend to do is use the word ethics in humanist circles because there is so much Christian or religious, at least, baggage circulated and attached to the word morality. That said, secular morality absolutely exists. And one of the fundamental points of humanism and why it exists and why it's different than just pure atheism is atheism doesn't tell you anything other than the answer to one question. Is there a God or not? Or do you believe in God or not? But humanism is, well, we've answered that question, or at least, decided to put that one aside. But what else, right? So humanism starts to talk about how do we approach the world? How do we approach our interpersonal relationships? How do we understand our purpose? And all of those are derived from secular reason. And that's how we get an ethical framework. But we could also call it a non-religious morality. And I'm happy with people to use whichever word they're most comfortable with. But, if I was writing something for a press release, I'd probably use the word ethics just because of that baggage. In the same way, I probably wouldn't use the word spiritual, but I know many humanists do use the word spiritual and don't mean something supernatural. But that's getting into controversial territory for some people.
Yeah, that's interesting. Those words exactly. And they can cause trouble for sure. I know for me, when I think of spiritual, I just think of feeling connected. So when I go out in nature or when I spend time with other people, but there are definitely people who see it very differently from that. Okay, this one I also thought was interesting. Humanists reject all forms of racism and prejudice and believe in respecting and protecting everyone's human rights, including the right to freedom of religion and belief. How about when people's religious beliefs deny human rights? And is this something to be addressed when people move to Canada from very religious regimes?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So the broad principles of humanism tend to be universalist and idealistic, like the tenets of any kind of approach. In terms of anti-racism, we can look, I'm reading Dr. Adam Rutherford's book, How to Argue with a Racist, right now. I got it from my library, and it's this, nice little biologists, geneticists look at what is race, and he just keeps hammering the point that race doesn't actually exist. Like, what we see doesn't mirror what the genes really tell us. And even those 23andMe type approaches to trying to figure out what your history is mostly, what did he call it? Astrology for like geneticists.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's bunk. It's just so stories that try to make you feel good. And we want to have stories, right? But, you have a broader question there about religious freedom. And it is a complex and challenging one to balance when you have this important approach of, we do need religious freedom, right? Both to protect the non-religious, but also to protect people of minority faiths from being pressured into or out of faith. And it's really about individual autonomy. And that's one of the big core values of humanism. And so what happens in the situation you describe, where people who are more devoutly religious and have a theocratic approach, whether they, I think, are born in Canada or immigrate here from elsewhere, because we have a domestic Christian nationalist problem that I'm far more worried about than many immigrants in most cases, because people do tend to, I don't want to say assimilate, but adopt some of the values of the broader community. The challenge then is, how do we balance competing rights? And the way we tend to approach it is, you do have your right to your religion, but you don't have your right to push your religion on others. It's kind of like the approach, you can swing your arms, but your right to swing your arms ends at my face, right? You can't connect with someone else and harm them. And it gets obviously complicated in the law. And, we follow a lot of religious freedom cases in Canadian courts and have been involved in a few as the BC Humanist Association. And finding that balance is always tricky, but we try to focus on the individual has the right to believe what they want, but they don't have necessarily the right to push that on others or to get special treatment from the state.
Right. And of course, all my work is in the field of religious trauma syndrome. And this, by and large, occurs or has roots in how people are raised when they're growing up as children in homes with believing parents, and particularly fundamentalists of any stripe. And of course, children lack the ability to critically evaluate the truth claims that the parents are making. And sometimes it can be quite significant if the parents are then insisting that the daughter, it's always a daughter, has to dress a certain way and restricting her ability to just move through life as a human equal to other humans. And this is problematic. This is what I brush up against all the time.
Yeah. And I don't disagree with those challenges, right? It's easy to talk about these conflicts in vague terms, but when we break it down into those specific human stories and those families, often it gets really challenging. And we can look at history in Canada at, how do we deal with this, and what can be the approach in south of where you are is the Doukhobor community, for example, or the fundamentalist Mormons are down there too. And in both of those cases, the government has tried in different ways to break them, essentially. They stole kids away from the Doukhobor communities because they didn't like the approach that religion was. And in many ways, it was a cult. And, should the state have a role in saving children? Well, we see from history when they try and do that, they often make things much worse. But that doesn't mean that the status quo is also good. And so I don't have a good answer here for you, but these are difficult conversations to navigate. I just caution anyone to suggest the answer is black and white, or that, and one of the things we do try and talk up a lot, or we should talk up a lot more, is the rights of children. There's this broader discussion or attempt to emphasize parental rights, especially around schools and trans kids and things like this. But from a humanist perspective, you have all of the rights from the day you are born until the day you die. to individual autonomy and these things. And that doesn't mean a child can make an informed choice, because obviously a baby can't make choices. And so we see, rather than parental rights, it's more parental duties and responsibilities to raise a citizen who can make those choices to the best of their ability. And I think once we start to think of children in that way, they become less property, which is how so many religions view them. I see you nodding there, and more humans, right? Human beings who can participate. And that's so important.
Yes. Yes. I love it. It's so great. You mentioned some lawsuits that BC Humanist Association has been involved in. Are you allowed to tell us about any of those?
We're only involved in one right now that's active, and it's already finished its hearing, so I can talk about everything. We've done a few interventions at the Supreme Court of Canada. One was in the Trinity Western University versus Law Society of BC case. This was an attempt by a evangelical private university in Langley, BC, to open a law school. And they were going to require every student who goes there to sign a community covenant that says they wouldn't have sex outside of a heterosexual marriage, effectively barring LGBTQ students from attending this law school. There was a big push by queer groups to have the Law Society reject this, and ultimately they did, including bravely by so many lawyers themselves who spoke out about this. Credit to them. They really pushed the Law Society to be more progressive on this. And then there was a fight over whether the university had the religious freedom to operate, or whether the Law Society had a overarching purpose to protect the equal access to the law for queer students. And in the end, the Supreme Court of Canada decided in favor of the Law Society. And our intervention at the Supreme Court there was to argue that as an institution, as a, thing that exists on paper and bricks and mortar, it doesn't have beliefs, right? It's the people who go there that have beliefs. And there are students there who believe that you can be gay and that is okay, and their rights aren't being respected. And so ultimately we had a little bit of influence in that decision. We've been involved in a couple other decisions around membership in churches. We actually intervened on the side of some people who were expelled for heresy, for being too fundamentalist from a church in Ontario, because those ones were alleging that the organization didn't follow its bylaws in expelling them. And we said, what's the point of bylaws if not to, what are these rules if you're not following them? And it shouldn't matter whether you're a religious or secular organization. You should have to follow your rules. And ultimately, the court decided it didn't have the space to adjudicate that question because it was a private body, but it didn't decide it in a way that favored religion over non-religion, or a religious group over a secular group. And there's some technical reasons why, but ultimately that's a good decision because it didn't give additional protections for the religious group. And right now, I think the really interesting case we're involved in is from a couple rural BC Jehovah's Witnesses congregations, where people who had left those groups have used the Privacy Act in BC to ask for all the records that their former congregations have on them. And this is a right everyone in British Columbia and mostly across Canada, it varies a little bit by province, has to ask any organization for the data you have on me, including public bodies, but also private ones. And the Jehovah's Witnesses were happy to say, we have your name, we have your email, that kind of stuff, but they didn't want to give out the private deliberations they had on the spiritual values of these ex-members. And so now there is an ongoing battle in court over whether there is a so-called religious privilege exemption to the privacy law, or if the overarching purpose of ensuring that people have data privacy and access to that is preserved. And so that case was heard by the Supreme Court of BC, our lowest court. I know it's called Supreme, it gets confusing, a couple months ago, and the decision on that will probably come out next year sometime, and it will probably be appealed from there, from either side. So that one's going to be ongoing for a while, but we're very interested to see where that balance falls down.
Yeah, that is fascinating. It feels creepy thinking that a religious body, a church group, could have records that they keep that do go beyond someone's, name and email address.
Well, and it's, I mean, every organization does have data on people, both intentionally and unintentionally. Like our own organization, we keep a database, like every, political party out there, that has your name and your email, but it also has like how you've interacted with our website, because it tracks some of those things, like donation things. And that helps us fundraise and, say, oh, Janice signed these 3 petitions, so she's probably interested in these kind of issues. And, we try and disclose this on our privacy policy, but I think people aren't always aware where it gets, and that's fairly common. And, we all need to be transparent about that kind of thing. Where it gets problematic, and we've seen this, is in cases of abuse, especially. And there's no allegation of abuse in the case I brought up before, but we did see, for example, the Royal Commission in Australia looked into institutional abuse across society. And there was a big fight over whether the Jehovah's Witnesses and Roman Catholic Church had to disclose records. And ultimately they did. And it exposed what I imagine you can imagine.
Yeah, just terrible. Wow. I'm wondering what the crossover is with the BC Civil Liberties Association and the BC Humanist Association. So when you talk about going to court over different issues, is that something that the one group reaches out to the other, or are you guys just always on each other's radar? Or
it's varied over time. So we've only been involved in legal advocacy in the last few years. For a long time, we were a smaller organization that didn't have the capacity or the networks to find generous pro bono counsel. Mostly, like, the civil liberties issues are held by most humanists. And if we look back through history, there have been a number of members of our board who are also members of their board. Conrad Hadland was one of the most prominent, who is, one of our longtime members. And if we go back through history, the BCCLA, to put on my board member hat there and talk them up, has been involved in some of the key issues of secularism in BC. So in the late 1980s and early 90s, they were the organization that represented parents who wanted to end school prayer in BC. And this followed a couple cases in Ontario and elsewhere, and they were victorious in that. And in the mid-90s, they fought the Abbotsford School District over the teaching of creationism in public school science classrooms, and were victorious over that. And ultimately, the province forced them at the time to adopt a origins of life policy that, if you read, is really weird because it doesn't say anything controversial, but it shouldn't need to be said, other than the fact that I think there were a bunch of creationists on their board at the time who needed to be told that, like, teachers can believe what they want and students can believe what they want, but in the science classroom, you have to teach the curriculum. If a question comes up, avoid it or something.
Yeah. Wow. So I know I've read about I think it's BCHA, not the BC Civil Liberties, but specifically looking at prayer happening before civic meetings. So tell me a little bit about that and what BCHA has been doing.
Yeah, this has been a big focus of our work for the last few years, is this idea of legislative prayer or government prayer. And it's one of those issues where it's not top of mind for most people, and it's something I think we think of as more of a historic trend or practice that isn't necessarily happening in contemporary society, but in reality it is. And so we've been trying to document both what has been happening and advocating for its end. And like on a personal level, even when I was at the University of Alberta, our convocation, our graduation ceremony for everyone included a charge that everyone use their degree for glory of God and honor of your country in 2009 or 2008 at least. And so one of the things we did there when I was at the University of Alberta Atheists and Agnostics is we lobbied the university to amend this and to change this. And one student had complained about it previously, but hadn't gotten very far. But we did a really concerted effort. And following our efforts, we got the university administration to agree to amend it, at least to, for all who believe to serve your God. And then it went on from there. And it's like, I don't think that made anyone happy, but I think there was some religious pressure to maintain some theism in that ceremony. But it was, a compromise I was happy to live with. And then a few years later, a more secular-minded university administrator, who I think actually was a former or still like religious person, but just understood secularism, right? Because most secularism is valuable for religious and non-religious people, abolished that line entirely. And now the charge is fully secular there. And that's just positive to see from an inclusive perspective, right? These ceremonies are important and they do signal the values of the institution. And so when we look across Canada at legislative prayer, we see a number of provinces and the House of Commons and Senate still open with prayers. I don't have our full list, but we have done a report called Legislative Prayer Across Canada that looks at what's happening. Here in BC, every day that the legislature meets, a different member, a different politician stands up and does a prayer or reflection. And this was just prayers until 2019. And this has been going on as long as they've been meeting as a legislature, I guess. We couldn't find the original history of it. But what happened is we studied these and looked at, because they aren't transcribed, we had to go through the videos and record them and transcribe them. And we had volunteers help us with that. And so we transcribed 870 prayers and analyzed them using some statistical methods to show that they are unsurprisingly overwhelmingly theistic, and where we could identify the religion, it was Christian, 90% of the time, something like that. Mm-hmm. And there was very few secular alternatives. There were a couple notable ones. There was a member from the Sunshine Coast that once said, I thank God for the separation of church and state, in a kind of ironic approach. And there were a couple weird ones. There was a prayer where a member prayed that a union that the government was fighting in contract negotiations or was on strike would that God would help them see the light and come to a negotiated settlement, which seemed inappropriate. But for the most part, they were, the positive sentiments of religion, but still emphasized theism over non-theism in the legislature.
So unnecessary and fundamentally disempowering whenever we're saying that our power lies in a source outside of us. I have a big problem with that.
Yeah. And so when we released our big report on that in 2019, it did prompt the government to agree to change it from prayers to prayers and reflections, which again is one of those, I feel like, stepping stones to secularism that some of these institutions don't want to take. Now, the prayer at the federal parliament is just a standard one that was written a number of years ago, and it changed a couple times over the years, but it's just read by the speaker before even guests are allowed in the chambers. So it's kind of a more closed thing. And neither of those we can easily challenge constitutionally. There might be a way, but generally, I think most scholars agree that they are protected by something called parliamentary privilege, which allows the people who run the chamber, our politicians, to run their affairs their own way. And it doesn't let the charter apply in the same way that it does to municipalities. And why we've been looking at municipalities most recently is in 2015, there was a Supreme Court of Canada case coming out of Quebec that challenged a prayer in a town there that made its way all the way. It was initially a very Catholic prayer where the mayor was crossing himself during it. And after he was challenged, he tried to make it a non-denominational prayer, but the Supreme Court threw both of those out, saying they offend the state's duty of religious neutrality, which is a fancy way of saying it has to be secular.
Wow. Yeah. Quebec, I feel like, is really an interesting place. So on the one hand, there was the move afoot to say that no government, no people acting in a government capacity or even teachers or anything like that could wear religious iconography. And then on the other hand, it seems like a very Catholic province traditionally. So I don't know. What do you think about that?
So Quebec ties a bit closer to the French idea of laïcité, which is translated as secularism, and it's why I think the Supreme Court of Canada doesn't use the word secular because of the translation. They'd rather just be very clear about what they mean. And laïcité is a very strict separation of religion and government, to the point where people representing government shouldn't even display a religious thing on their person. The idea here being that there should be neutrality. And, we support neutrality, but one of the challenges here is, what about the individual's personal expression? And what comes up so much in these cases that you're citing is, you have someone who is Muslim, for example, who is devout and wants to wear a hijab or a turban, it's very often not white people will notice who are wearing these religious garbs. And in some of the early things, they said, well, it's still okay if they wear a little cross. You're like, you're really telling on yourself then. But some of the more, at least, consistent proponents of laïcité will say that the cross is not okay because it feels like you need to say that to be consistent. We've generally, in the BC Humanist Association, taken a more, we call it an open approach to secularism, where it's about the individual. The state shouldn't be coercing individuals, whether that's teachers, other government officials, from what they can and can't do, except in their official capacity as a state representative. So this is why a prayer at the start of a council meeting is inappropriate, because it's the council or the government saying, this is what we believe. If a politician wants to say in a speech, I'm voting on this because I'm Catholic, they have that right, but we also have the right not to vote for them because of that if you disagree with their interpretation or that way they bring that religion in.
Something else that I find really odd, and I wasn't aware of it growing up in British Columbia, but that the farther east that we go, it seems the idea that, so we have just public schools in BC and private school. You maybe want to send your kid to a Christian school or just a regular public school. But it seems like in some other provinces, there are also Catholic schools that the government helps fund. Is that accurate? Because that just seems not right.
Doesn't just help fund, fully funds. So Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Alberta have fully funded Catholic systems. And to understand why, because I don't think either of us really agree with this approach, is the weird history and the unique history of Canada is kind of this dual colonial country where you had the English Protestants and the French Catholics fighting over this land and these territories. The English ultimately won, but there were so many French Catholics here that they needed to find a compromise. And what they said is, all right, there'll be two school systems basically everywhere. There will be a dominant system to represent either the local Catholic or Protestant majority, and then there will be a minority system for the others, the separate school system. And so across English Canada, we had Protestant school systems and minority Catholic systems. And the Protestant systems became secular in the early 20th century. In BC, it was always secular, I should say. From the very first School Act in BC said our school system is non-sectarian and secular in the law. And that was unique. And I can talk about BC's very unique history in a little bit, but these minority faith systems were basically, if there was one when the province joined Confederation, they got to keep it. And so that's why Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Alberta have it. Quebec actually did have a minority Protestant system, but it amalgamated them all in 1997. Newfoundland had 7 religious school systems, I think.
Oh my
because
God.
Yeah, it was an utter mess from like just a logistic approach. And in the mid 90s, they had a referendum and decided to move to one secular system. Now, these separate school systems are protected by the Constitution of Canada. And so to get rid of one, you need it's a little bit easier than changing our Constitution, and any Canadians, especially older ones, will remember the constitutional fights following the charter in the early 90s. This is easier. The province and the federal government just need to agree to do what's called a bilateral amendment, and they can basically get rid of these school systems. So people say they're really hard to get rid of, but they're actually not. They just don't want to because they don't want to pick a fight with a very organized lobby of religious groups. But yeah, we still have 3 provinces that fully fund religious schools. Now, BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan also fund private schools. not as much. BC gives them up to 50% of the funding of a local public school. And this was brought in the mid-late 1970s as kind of a, let's be honest, a neoliberal approach to education to allow school choice and the idea that there'd be competition in the market and therefore all schools would get better from this. But in reality, most of them are religious. And we've done analysis to show that most of the schools that get funding under this private school model are religious. And overwhelmingly, those are Catholic and Christian schools in BC. And there are like a couple Sikh ones. There's one or two Muslim ones and a couple Jewish ones. But overwhelmingly, it's a way to fund largely evangelical Christians too. It's not even
But how can that be when we know that there will be anti-LGBTQ two-spirit teaching taking place or encouraged in those schools? How can the government be party to that?
It's a great question because it's even more complicated than that, because under the previous government in BC, the BC Liberals in the latter part of their term saw the importance and were pushed to really bring protections for LGBTQ students in schools. There was a big push for anti-bullying strategies, the erase strategy, and people pointed out, that's great, but you really need to make sure that these schools are protecting people of all sexual orientations and gender identities and gender expressions. And so they brought in a rule that every school district, including these private schools, had to have an anti-harassment policy for their students to protect them. And it had to mention that they must be protected from harassment on these specific grounds: sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. So your, doesn't believe gay people exist evangelical school has a policy that says they can't discriminate. The Catholic district that has a policy that says everyone is born man or woman biologically also has a policy that says they shouldn't discriminate based on gender identity. And I don't know how they've squared that. And all we've found is that the bureaucrat, the inspector who's in charge of the inspections of independent schools, every one of them has come from basically being a former principal of an evangelical school, not even just a private school superintendent. So we're not saying they're biased, but that's just their history.
That is just, oh gosh, there are some.
And so we do advocate for big changes on there, and to at least take their funding away.
Yeah. So now BC is kind of a different province as far as when it comes maybe to secularism or secular thinking. Talk a little bit about British Columbia's history.
Yeah, that's one that I've always found fascinating, right? Because I grew up in Alberta, and as I moved to BC, there's political differences, there's historical differences. And what I found reading books from people like Lynn Marks, who's a historian at University of Victoria, and Tina Block, a historian at Thompson Rivers University in Kamloops, have both written on non-religious history in BC and who are these irreligious people. And what we found is because of BC's unique geography, it was like the last place in North America to be settled by Europeans. There were always people here, right? There was very diverse First Nations communities across British Columbia, but the European settlement took place much later here and in a very different process. A lot of it was driven by Americans seeking mineral prospects, either gold or other precious minerals coming up from mining. And then it was a lot of other weird people came here, frankly, like people trying to escape religious persecution. So there were a lot of cults or new religious movements that came here. Yeah. And people who were non-religious, they got here and the churches weren't well established, so they just didn't feel like going. And because we also had this resource extraction history, there was always a stronger labor movement than in many other provinces, and those very radical coal mining type unions, or we didn't have the coal mining necessarily, but mining unions, right? And those groups were infected with Marxism and socialism, for good or ill, depending on your perspective, but that meant they often took those kind of critiques of religion. So BC's history of non-religion was often more working class than what we saw in Eastern Canada, where it was the more intellectual approach. Here it was just, we have no use for that because God says we can't go to the brothel and the saloon after, and therefore why would we follow your religion? And so there's just always been a bit more of that American influence from some of the founding fathers, idealistic secularism, as well as that working class and that socialism and all that mixed. It meant even in early 20th century BC, 7 or 8% of people in the Kootenays were non-religious, which was an unheard of portion in that era in North America. And that's just evolved over the years. And, today it's 52% no religion according to the census. And when you ask people how many actually go to church on a weekly basis, it's like 10 or 11% province-wide.
Wow. Okay. And I feel super nervous when I look at the United States and see the rise of Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism, really, and I see that also wanting to happen here. And it seemed like the pandemic really solidified. It moved people more towards radicalization. And I'm worried about that happening here. And certainly I know that in the Okanagan is considered a part of the Bible Belt, as is Abbotsford in the Lower Mainland. We have our MPs, the people representing us here to the government, are all Christian people. Like, it's by and large Christians who are the voice. I've got my air quotes going. And I find that frustrating. And I even worry about things like people running for school board who are overtly or covertly religious, and they have their own agenda going on. Is that something that the BC Humanist Association and BC Civil Liberties, is that something you guys keep watch on?
I mean, we're starting to, and we're paying attention to it. I won't speak for the BCCLA because I'm not on the staff side there, but in terms of, one of the things to remember as I speak about the history of BC is there's also, we have that strong secular history. We also do have a very strong religious movement in this province. So, you mentioned a couple different areas that are like Bible belts of this province, and they've exerted their influence at different times. And there were temperance unions. We had the prohibition for a bit here in BC, although not to the same level as many other places. And we have much better history of rum running than of prohibition in this province. But, you jump forward into some of the later years. One of our premiers, Bill Vander Zalm, he was a very devout evangelical Christian who ran a Bible theme park as his day job called Fantasy Gardens. So, and he only ran one term, but if you read the stories about him, he comes off very Trump-like in all his language and approaches. And the only reason that he didn't do more to try to prevent abortions from being allowed in BC after that was decriminalized in 1988 was because there were a number of strong women in his cabinet, including Kim Campbell, who went on to become premier, who said they will bring his government down if he tries to criminalize abortion again after Morgentaler, a humanist, went all the way to the Supreme Court and got it struck down. And so in some ways, this, new movement isn't that new, right? It's always been there. We saw in the mid-2000s a rise in it that supported the Stephen Harper conservatives and really tried to push for, more restrictions on all of the kind of progressive values that we tend to take for granted at times. And thankfully, the broader society has pushed back on that and there hasn't been as much damage done. But one of the things I think we're seeing now, as you mentioned, is there's a disconnection almost between church attendance and this kind of new Christian nationalism, right? People who, Donald Trump is not a churchgoer by anyone's understanding, but he is the patron saint of Christian nationalism because he will do their bidding. And that kind of approach, I'm not saying churches necessarily inoculate people from conspiracy theories. That's definitely not the case. But the new online almost church, the online approach that people are taking to finding out about the world has so many dangers to it. The internet is a blessing in a secular way in so many different ways. We can learn more than we ever have, but misinformation is so rampant. And so in terms of politics here, I think you nailed it, that school boards and these lower levels of government are so at risk. That's one of the reasons we work so hard on prayers at municipal councils and have been so successful there, is we can lobby them and we can affect them a lot more. And it's an important reason people need to get involved. And we're going to start looking at school boards more too. We've looked at some of their policies recently, and most school boards in BC are thankfully pretty progressive, and the unions are pretty strong on that side. And I think school boards don't have as much power in Canada as they do in the States. So some of the concerns are a little bit less pronounced, but that said, they can still do a lot of damage and make schools unsafe for children.
Yes. Yes. Would you talk for a minute or two about the whole marriage deal? I know that's something that BCHA has been working on for humanists to have the same right when it comes to performing weddings. So if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, BC, I haven't looked at how the Marriage Act works in every different province, but it works a little bit different everywhere. And I think when people think about getting married, they think, I need to get a justice of the peace if you're secular, or you go to your priest if you're religious, or, you're a religious official. And BC has kind of divided that system up. So we have two ways you can get married in BC. You can go to your religious representative, provided they are recognized by the government, and most big religions are, and a number of smaller ones. And I'll get into the weird ones in a minute. And then there's some real weird ones in there. And that's not to disparage them, right? They do the work that they want to do. Or you can go to what's called a marriage commissioner. And marriage commissioners are civil marriage officials appointed by the province who, there are a number of requirements. They have to be retired, or at least semi-retired. There's only so many vacancies. Yeah, it can't be a career. Your rates are fixed by the province by regulation, so you can only charge $75 for a ceremony, I believe. You can charge a little bit for travel, but there's a fixed amount for that. But it really restricts it, so you can't be a full celebrant as we see exist out there. And I'll talk about why we do see some exist in a minute. And you can't make it a career or profession, and you can't bring, in many ways, your own worldview to it. So what we know a lot of people want, and we see this elsewhere in the world, is they want someone to do their marriage who reflects their values. So in Norway, where there's a very large humanist association, in Scotland and in Ontario even, you can have humanists perform your marriage. And in a number of states, it varies a lot. Some states have online certification, and basically anyone can do a marriage. I think even Alberta has that, but it's changed at times. Not quite an online, but like a temporary permit to do a marriage, which in many ways makes sense, because ultimately, in addition to your ceremony, you also have to have a marriage license that you get from, a registry office. Or London Drugs, of all places, often has the contract to do marriage licenses out of their passport office.
Wow.
I don't even know what to do with that question. It's fine, I guess. But for someone who is secular or non-religious, I was lucky in that one of the marriage officiants in the Lower Mainland was a longtime humanist and a member of our association, so I was able to have her do our ceremony. You could have the marriage officiant sit in the corner and just basically observe someone else do the marriage, which is pretty paternalistic to a humanist. Or you can find someone who is designated a religious celebrant. And many of the people who will advertise themselves as celebrants in BC who will perform marriages are registered as effectively ministers of the Church of the Metaphysical Ministry. And I'm not exactly sure how that group got recognized as a religion, because the BC Humanist Association did apply in 2013 to be a religious organization for the purposes of the Act. Whether humanism is a religion or not is a longer question and conversation we could have. Often we say no, but sometimes for the purposes of law, it does make sense. And they ultimately said, you don't believe in God, therefore you aren't a religion.
Wow.
And this was despite, we didn't just write a letter. We had written a letter previously just asking, and had been rejected. But in 2013, we put together a full application. We had all our documents in order that they wanted. We showed the longevity of our organization. We showed the membership we have. We showed a structure we were going to use to appoint officiants and certify them. But the government ultimately just rejected us. And we didn't pursue a legal challenge at that time, but we might have to in the future. And it's weird because like Zen Buddhists are recognized and they don't believe in God either. Scientologists are recognized even though they are not recognized by the CRA as a religious charity in Canada.
Wow. Wow. That is just, it seems like such an obvious area of prejudice against people who don't believe in God. And I know when I got married a year and a half ago, we certainly didn't want anyone religious performing our ceremony, but we had a hard time. We couldn't find someone who was justice at a peace, with my air quotes going on there. So we looked and looked and finally found a celebrant. And I told them several times, we're not religious. We don't want any talking about religion, spirituality, nothing. And I thought I made it quite clear. And then they showed up, and the paperweight that they brought, because we got married outside to hold down the papers, was an angel. And they were really delighted by that. And it just was so frustrating. Like, it just, people don't get it, and people deserve to be married by people that reflect their own beliefs and values. So I know CASHA is working with BCHA to see what we can do to try and change this.
Yeah, and it's been so frustrating because we've written to the government about this multiple times and they just brush it off every time. And it's such a simple fix. They could either amend the Marriage Act to follow the model Scotland has done, which is to expand the religious category to include belief systems, or they could do a more radical change and abolish the solemnization entirely, or there are different ways to do this. They could do a special exemption just for our organization. There are ways around this to move it forward, but there's just like an unwillingness to take it seriously. And it is offensive, I think. I think it's hurtful to have that from the government.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ian, I'm so grateful for the role that you play in our province and the work that you're doing. And I really feel honored to know you and to be working with you and trying to support you in any way that I can. So thank you very much for talking with me today. And is there a way for people to get in touch with you or your organization?
Absolutely. We have so much more on our website at bchumanist.ca. We didn't even get to talk about our recently released end of life guide that we're super proud of.
Let's take a couple minutes actually and talk about that, because that was on my list. Yes. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So that was an update to a pamphlet essentially that we'd written and released a couple years ago by Sophie Burke. And I worked with her to expand it into a short ebook looking at how do the non-religious approach end of life and death? This is a conversation I think most people don't want to have, but is so important. Whether you're, terminally ill or even just a younger, healthy person, you should be thinking about this because, death can come sadly at any point. And if you don't make the proper preparations, you can make it so much harder on your survivors, on your loved ones. And it can also be a really empowering approach to think about these things and think about what kind of legacy do you want to do. And so the guide we wrote goes through all of these approaches. It talks about a bit of humanist philosophy of death, which is that, we do believe this is the one life we have and it ends when you die, but your impact on the world doesn't. And so how can you work that into your memorial? And how can you involve your friends in your memorial? It also addresses some of the healthcare issues. It looks at medical assistance in dying, something humanists have long supported in Canada. And what are the challenges there? One of which is we still have Catholic hospitals that don't allow it to happen on their facilities, and you have to face forced transfers. So if you're looking at hospice care, maybe it's important to make sure that that they will respect you and not your doctor's wishes or the board of directors' wishes, right? And finally, we look at some of the extra challenges brought forward in recent years by just the overlapping crises of COVID, the toxic drug crisis here in BC and many other places, and climate change. And how are these impacting how we approach death and what kind of other considerations should you do. Overall, we try to do a descriptive kind of approach that leaves a lot of room for people to think about themselves. Because again, humanism is non-dogmatic. We don't have a prescriptive way that this is what a humanist death looks like, but rather, how can we structure a ceremony, a ritual, if you want that to reflect your own personal values. And so we're really proud of that guide, and it's available for free. It's on our website, and it's also actually up on Amazon and other ebook publishers. So we did a full release on that.
Awesome. And you said that's bchumanist.ca?
Yes, we're on there. We're on most social media platforms as at BC Humanist. We're not really active on Twitter anymore because of just, it doesn't really align with our values. We're a little bit active on Threads. We're very active on TikTok these days, and we're getting some great engagement from viewers there. And that's been a lot of fun to grow that.
Nice.
We still have a Facebook and Instagram page, but with the blocking of news and just the way those algorithms work, they haven't been as friendly for us. But, our email newsletter, our TikTok, and just getting to chat on podcasts like this is how we get our message out, right?
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you giving me a whole hour this morning to talk about these things. And I want to thank you for joining us, for listening to this important conversation today. If you want to reach out to me, you're welcome to do so. My website is divorcing-religion.com. And I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks, Ian. Take care.
Thank you so much, Janice.